Hello everyone and welcome back to Beastcoast Pokemon. Today, James and I are here to talk about the 2023 European International Championships, which was the largest VGC Internationals in the history of the game. Had almost 800 players competing in the Masters division, took place in London in the middle of April, and James and I were both there, so we're here to give some insight into the tournament and of course talk about the top players and teams from that tournament. So James, how are you feeling? I know we just got back from London.
Yeah, I'm feeling great. London was an amazing city. I think for both of us, the tournament could have went a little bit better, but overall, London is always a great time. Amazing city overall, and it was a great tournament to watch, especially.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, with this being in the Regulation C format, which of course introduced the Ruin Pokemon, there were a lot of questions about how the metagame would look like, especially since we only had 1 or 2 regionals basically before this event, and we were only kind of 2 weeks into the format. You know, James and I first wanted to talk a little bit about our personal experiences preparing for the event, and then maybe how the event shaped out relative to our preparations. I'll say for me personally, I ended up bringing like a Palafin rain team centered around like Pelipper Palafin. So there's one mode where obviously you kind of use Palafin to just clear through your opponent. Also ended up having a Nasty Plot safety goggles Chi-Yu, which I noticed a bunch of other players that actually brought to the tournament kind of independently as well, which was interesting. And the idea is that set in particular has a really good matchup against a lot of the balanced teams. I expected to play a lot of like the Palafin balanced teams, very much like the 2 teams that ended up in the finals. Prepared really hard for those. Was not maybe as prepared for Dondozo, and I went 6 wins, 3 losses, and all of my losses were actually to Dondozo, 2 being the Dondozo team that ended up finishing in the top 4, and then 1 to this crazy Surf Dondozo with Life Orb. And so I had like kind of plans against Dondozo, but a lot of these Dondozo teams were just super well constructed, and I found in best of 3 it was really hard to adapt accordingly. Only actually played, I think, 2 or 3 Palafin balanced teams out of my 9 rounds of Swiss.
Yeah, for me, it was a bit of a different story. I had 4 different versions of a team I really wanted to try out, and then my friends decided to convince me to use King Gambit. And since I was comfortable with King Gambit, it was better into like general like balanced stuff, but a little bit weaker in some of the matchups I was a little bit worried about, such as Shiyu Fluttermane and maybe some weather. Then I just decided to go with the King Gambit. But oh boy, my run was probably an outlier compared to the event. I faced 4 different weather teams, 2 different Shiyu Fluttermanes in 5 rounds of Swiss because I went 2-3 drop. My worst performance, I think, out of any tournament, I think. That is what happens when you have a big run. Like I faced more Pelipers than I did Arcanines, which is something pretty insane to say. I had 1 Arcanine that I faced the entire 5 rounds of Swiss. Did not face a single Palafin balance team. I faced Palafin Rain, which was a bit harder. And yeah, I really am kicking myself for not bringing the Tyranitar version of the team that I wanted over to King Gambit, which I think would have allowed me to secure those matchups or at least have a better time than King Gambit, which overall city was great. Tournament, not the greatest. I wasn't playing that hot alongside RNG, like just a bunch of cards that just went against me, I think, throughout that tournament. But that is just what happens sometimes, especially if you've been playing as long as like 10+ years. Like you can't get every tournament right.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And if you look at like the number of really like champion caliber players that didn't even make it to day 2, there's so many, right? Including last year's champion Eric Rios, who has had a tremendous start to this season as well. So yeah, let's actually break down some of the top teams and kind of what surprised us from this tournament. So I've got the top 8 teams pulled up right now. I think it was funny, right? The finals ended up being like near mirror in terms of at least just the Pokemon. Paul had the Roaring Moon, whereas Gabrielle had the Baxcalibur. But yeah, going into this tournament, like we've already known that the Palafin Amoongus Arcanine core is one of the best. We've seen it dominate in other formats in Scarlet and Violet already. Fluttermane is everywhere right now. Ting Lu just like fits this team in particular so nicely. It's just so bulky and difficult to knock out. Just strong, powerful Pokemon. Physical Pokemon can dish out consistent damage, are still really good in the format.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting that there's like slight adjustments to improve some things for the players. Like for instance, Paul, obviously Ting Lu is very, known for Fisher, and he actually did run Fisher at the Fort Wayne Regional Championship, but changed it to Sand Tomb, and seeing these trap moves such as like Whirlpool on Gyarados and the Sand Tomb on Ting Lu. Sand Tomb can trap opponents and really make it easier for yourself. And I think Gabriel Agati, who got 2nd place, has some really cool techs, especially on the Palafin with Substitute, and then instead instead, you would normally see Haze on Palafin, especially for Dondozo, which we saw in this tournament. But instead of adjusting and bringing the Clear Smog Amoongus, which I thought made it really smart because Substitute on Palafin was really strong in most general matchups, but you didn't need the Haze because of the Clear Smog Amoongus, which I thought was pretty brilliant on his side.
You know, it's interesting having run Haze Palafin myself at the tournament. Like, I actually, against all 3 Dondozos, I think I maybe clicked Haze once in like across 8 games. And so part of the difficulty in using Haze and Palafin is like you still need to position properly, right? Because like Dondozo can just outspeed you and very likely will, especially with how people have been using Dondozo recently and with, you know, lack of speed investment on Palafin. Substitute is really nice because Amoongus is everywhere in the format. And so by getting a substitute up, you kind of just wall Amoongus, especially since most Amoonguses aren't running like a Giga Drain or a grass type attack. Yeah, I've seen substitute on Fluttermane trending a lot going into this tournament. And one other thing you called out was the Clear Smog on Amoongus. And, you know, substitute Dondozo, I feel like was really common in Series 1, but I feel like sub has just really fallen off in terms of popularity as a move choice. And so it's a really smart meta call saying, hey, I realize this move is now trending downwards. And so Clear Smog actually has a lot more viability for me. Whereas previously, you know, if you set up a sub with Dondozo, you just kind of wall the Clear Smog. And so it's kind of these small meta calls that I think are really smart. The Arcanine specifically had Howl as well, which we had seen trend up a little bit in usage in the earlier regionals. And the idea is Howl is really nice with your physical attackers, especially Baxcalibur and even Tinglu, right? Like, I think people see Tinglu as like a really defensive Pokemon, but this thing can just like slowly add up so much damage while being really difficult to knock out.
Yeah, 115 attack is no joke, especially if like it's super high bulk. If you give it a Assault Vest, it is very hard to knock out, but it can actually do some damage. But overall, we've seen a lot of the Palafin balance, and then we were seeing Dondozo, which you were talking about. And I think this tournament probably surprised a lot of players because there were quite a lot of Dondozos, I think, throughout this tournament. Like, there were 16 in the top 128, which is probably a lot more than what we've seen previously in usage stats. And then in day 2, there were 9 Dondozos in total out of 70 teams. And I think we've seen quite a few adjustments specifically on the sets as well. Terra Grass is a common Dondozo we've seen with Terra Blast to punish Palafin, as you mentioned before. But I think a new tech that we've been seeing, as Dondozo used to run Unaware, mostly for the mirror specifically, and for setup, of course, but has kind of fallen off because of less setup. And now the most common Dondozo in day 2 was Oblivious. Now, if you don't know what Oblivious is, the main effect players use Oblivious for is the effect where it negates Intimidate, which is very nice into Arcanine balance because, of course, you can't get your attack lowered, so you can actually just dish out +2 attacks pretty consistently. And with Terra Grass, you can just ignore Amoongus redirection and just attack the Palafin, which most of them are Terra Water, so you could just one-shot that, and you can't really prevent Dondozo with a Haze like you would in common situations like we've seen previously.
Exactly, yeah. And having fought against actually the specific Dondozo team, you know, Alexander, who ended up finishing the top 4, I actually fought against him in round 7 of Swiss, as well as Chuppa Cross, who was using the same team. I believe Carson Confer, who was the senior division world champion in 2016, also had brought that team, and we also saw it in the top 4 as well. Two of different versions of this team in the top 4, right? And so it's really hard to play against because there's essentially 3 different modes of the team. There's Dragonite plus Glamora, and even Dragonite plus Glamora has a lot of flexibility. For example, on the version that Lex and Chuppa were using, you could like Grass Terry or Glamora and Self Earthquake to set up the Toxic Spikes immediately through Glamora's ability. Iron Bundle Chi-Yu is a very fast-paced offensive lead. Honestly, I don't know about how you were feeling about Bundle going into this tournament. I thought Bundle's usage had really like decreased significantly, but out of the top 8 teams, I think 4 of the teams had Bundle. So I was kind of incorrect on that call. Like, I just felt like I wasn't seeing it nearly as much. As a result, like this booster bundle in particular was actually a nightmare for the team I had used to go up against. Sash Chi also looked really good on that team. Like, I basically struggled to get it to a point where I can like sweep their team with Palafin because like there were so many Palafin resists, and then like Chi had the Focus Sash as well. It was really good specifically against Palafin, whereas like almost the entire team resisted it. If not, they had, you know, Focus Sash on Chi or a defensive Grass Terra. And there was just 3 different modes where you can go Dondozo, Tatsu, Dragonite, Glamora, Bundle, Chi, and obviously you can mix all of those up as well. One thing we saw Lex, you know, do, bring Dondozo, but like not bring Tatsugiri, and he would lead it and just use it offensively because Wave Crash still just does a lot of damage, especially into like Fluttermane. So yeah, this feels like the new version of Dondozo, and honestly, it was really, really hard to fight against in my personal experience.
Yeah, there were even actually some solo Dondozo. There were actually like 6 Tatsugiri where there were 9 Dondozos in the day 2. So 3 of them were actually solo Dondozo.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is something to say. Iron Bundle also, I think it was a Pokemon where when you think about it, Trick Room is pretty much just non-existent in this format, and Bundle is pretty much one of the most consistent speed control setters because Tailwind, there really is not many Tailwind mons in this generation. So I think Iron Bundle having that speed advantage is just so nice, and it's no surprise that players really got to bring its also gives a little bit of trouble to, of course, Arcanine, Amoongus, and Palafin specifically, having super effective coverage. Well, those Pokemon can't really damage Iron Bundle for too much because of its high physical defense. So I think it was a really good pick for this IC. Basically, we talked about in our preview of will a no ruined Pokemon or ruinous Pokemon actually make it into the top 8 potentially, and yeah, it actually did. In top 8, Paul Reese actually did not have a single ruinous Pokemon.
Abrupt intermission.
He actually brought MausApe. MausApe has been so interesting throughout Scarlet and Violet VGC because it feels like everyone's always like, I have no MausApe matchup. I have no MausApe matchup. But MausApe like has not really made that many deep runs at events. And so it's really cool to see Paul, bring it and have a lot of success with it. The team makes a lot of sense. I thought, Water, Terra, Leftovers, Nasty Plot, Golden Go was always like a nightmare to fight against. And so Paul essentially had like Mouse plus bulky Golden Go. You can follow me, Nasty Plot, and just start sweeping immediately. One thing to note here is Annihilate has the Citrus Berry rather than Leftovers, mainly because Golden Go wants the Leftovers here. And then Paul has some pretty good support as well, right? You've got Tailwind and Breaking Swipe, Roaring Moon with booster energy, so you get speed control, slowly decrease your opponent's attack. Arcanine with Assault Vest, which I thought was pretty cool, just because so many people have been using like safety goggles on that, for example. The mouse hold on this team really wants goggles, because otherwise Amoongus can just redirect those beat ups away using a Rage Powder. And then a support Iron Bundle with Freeze Dry, Icy Wind, Encore Protect with the Covert Cloak. And so I like Paul's team because it feels like a pretty bulky team where you're not going to necessarily get knockouts immediately, right? It requires a little bit of setup, whether it be Golden Go getting that Nasty Plot, Annihilate getting that bulk up off, or the beat up into the Rage Fist combination. There's just so much bulk on the team to work with, and it's difficult to kind of just like overwhelm these Pokemon with offense immediately.
Yeah, it definitely reminds me of Hari's Series 2 Oceania team, where you got top 8 with very similar sets with the MausApe, a supportive Roaring Moon with Breaking Swipe, and then the Assault Vest Arcanine, as well as I believe it was Focus Sash Iron Bundle back then. But overall, it did really give me that vibes, and it looks like that team might be a little bit under the radar. I think there's something we need to talk about, Aaron, and that is the Pokemon Fluttermane with its high usage stats throughout the tournament. And if I'm looking at this top 18 is correct, which I just noticed, there are only three Fluttermanes.
Yeah, I'm like,
in the
am I like, is something in my eyes? Like, that's actually wild to me. And I, like, once you start scrolling beyond the top 8, it's like Fluttermane. I think like currently 9th place all the way down to 20th all had Fluttermane. 21st didn't. 22nd, 23rd did. It's like out of the top 32, like almost everyone that wasn't in the top 8 had one, basically.
Yeah, I think it's insane. For the viewers at home, I believe day 1 of the tournament had a 78% usage, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's 76, somewhere around that 70, the high 70 range. And then I think it was like a few percentage points higher in day 2. And the fact that only 3 made top 8 is absolutely insane. But it just shows how good this Pokemon is. Both the finalists did have Fluttermane, so it's still, of course, one of the top mons. Both of them, I believe, were the choice spec sets, so not too surprising. But we've seen a lot of booster energy, especially for the bulk, as well as substitutes being used, I think, throughout this tournament.
Yeah, I feel like booster was definitely the one thing I had really on my radar going into this tournament. Like, obviously, I knew specs was going to be common, but it felt like booster usage on Flutter was way higher relative to Series 2. And so, yeah, it is really interesting that in the top 8 there were so few, but afterwards there were so many. And then to kind of round out the other teams in the top 8, we had James Evans, who was the NAIC champion, using Talonflame kind of Tailwind hyper offense. Had Choice Specs Golden Go, which is a staple. Garchomp with Earthquake and Life Orb maximize damage. And then the Champao to decrease your opponent's defenses as well. And then we had a Dragonite Champao combo here from Julio. The main thing to call out here is it was a Dragon Dance set on the Dragonite, which was pretty cool with the Lumberry and multi-skill. That was one set that I knew I was really scared about fighting against going into this tournament. Akaberry Amoongus, just improve your kind of Chi-Yu matchup a little bit more. And then another Nasty Plot Water Terra Golden Go as well. I mean, Dragonite Champao I felt like was going to be pretty good going into this event. There was only one in the end out of the top 8. It's clearly still kind of, forced to be reckoned with. Ilias here in 7th place ended up using the Fisher Tinglu. Pretty standard balance with, Palafin, Amoongus, Arcanine, nothing too wild there. There was the substitute on the Fluttermane with booster energy on his team. And then AV Grass Iron Hands, which, is a set we've seen already throughout Scarlet and Violet VGC, but continues to be pretty solid. The main thing was the Tinglu on Ilias's team was not Assault Vest. It was actually Lumberry. It was Stomping, Fisher, Heavy Slam, and Protect. So I thought that was pretty interesting. The Arcanine didn't have Howl, but it actually had a Helping Hand instead as well.
Yeah, definitely some interesting interesting team choices. And let me just ask you, Aaron, what were your unexpected things just this day 2 usage stat? Because for me, I think there were quite a few things I could say for sure that I was expecting. Like, I thought she was pretty good. I didn't expect that this many she used to make it. There are actually a lot of them. Roaring Moon, I thought, was basically non-existent, but there are actually 3 of them in the top 32 by itself, and 2 of them made top 8, and a lot of Iron Hands, surprisingly, which we basically really fell out of usage in series 2. So I was a little bit shocked about that. So what were your surprises, do you think, looking at these day 2 teams?
Yeah, I think first of all, a lot of them are kind of the fire, water, grass, like balanced teams, which I expected to see. I'd say I thought there'd be a little bit more Wo-Chien. Like, I actually don't really see any Wo-Chien scrolling down, you know, even to like top 32. There's some individual Pokemon and players and sets that I want to call out. So David Kotesh used Orthworm, and that Pokemon has seen like very little usage relative to its potential. His team was so cool. It had like Bulldoze, Gyarados, which you can use to heal up the Orthworm. It had Earthquake Dragonite with Dragon Dance. It had Choice Band Tainlu with Bulldoze and Earthquake as well. So it's 3 different ways to heal up your Earthworm. And part of the idea is you can use the Iron Defense plus Shed Tail and just, you know, switch out and go into really any Pokemon, but especially Dragonite. Like, Dragonite under substitute with multi-skill, gets a Dragon Dance off, is an absolute beast. I feel like he really put Orthworm kind of on people's radars, which I thought was really awesome. We had a couple of Scream Tails as well. We had Juan, for example, who used a Booster Energy, Disable, Play Rough, Parasol Protect set, and I believe Colin Hire had also brought Screamtail to the tournament and made day 2 with it as well. I think we talked about Dondozo a little bit earlier. I wasn't expecting to play like 3 out of my 9 rounds, and of course one of the craziest teams, and the one that kind of eliminated me from the tournament ultimately, was by a Spanish player who is called Pablo, and he had such a wild team. It was like Life Orb, Surf, Wave Crash, Sleep Talk, Dondozo, Choice Band, Dreadnought, and it was kind of like hyper offense. You have like Dragonite Champao as one mode, Dondozo Tatsu as one mode, Pelipper Dreadnought as the other, and yeah, for me it was just like so many modes on these Dondozo teams that I struggled to fight against. Most of the teams in the top, like, or in day 2, I'd say were things I expected to see, but there were some unique picks that I called out.
Yeah, and I will just say, I was talking to Aaron earlier, and let me just say, I will never use Rotomosh ever again after this event unless it gets an accurate water type move, because it was not very on target there. But yeah, there were some very interesting teams. The very heavy water team that you faced for water mods, there was actually a team that had 6 physical attackers with Xianpao. It was quite surprising. I thought David Kutesh had like one of the coolest teams of the tournament. I think the Orthworm set with Tinglu, especially because Orthworm has pretty good defense when you get the Iron Defense set up, and then of course learning the special attack, and not many Pokemon can switch into ground types. There's very limited ground resist or immunities in this format right now. I think made it really, really valuable. For instance, while I'm running a Parish team was also really cool as well. I think the highest that Wo-Chien was, I think it was Megan Rattle, who's made it into day 2. So yeah, there are definitely some interesting choices. Yeah, I was also surprised about the high usage of Dondozo throughout this tournament. I think that was definitely a big surprise for me.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, just a couple of other big trends to call out. Like, it was clear, like, Gyarados, we already knew was pretty good in this format. And, you know, if you look at kind of the 9 through 16 teams, 9th place had it, 11th place had it, 12th place had it. A lot of these Gyaradoses are kind of a bulky support, right? And the idea behind Gyarados is it gives you Intimidate, which is really valuable into Palafin, just generally pretty bulky. It can also be really disruptive through things like Thunder Wave and Taunt. Yeah, I think, like, most of these Gyaradoses either have, like, a Citrus Berry. I played against some with safety goggles as well. And the idea is that it's not really going to do that much damage for you, but it can like slow things down. One thing that's really nice, of course, is being able to Thunder Wave like a Fluttermane and then Waterfall it as well. That's one set that definitely trended upwards, and a lot of people, especially within like the top 16, ended up having it. We even saw like Rocky Helmet being used on that as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. Nasty Plot Chi-Yu felt like something that a bunch of players had picked up on their radar that we saw within the top 16 as well. Corviknight had some pretty decent usage. Like, it was here in 12th place, here on 18th place, and it's a Pokemon that we had, you know, seen make it to the finals of Vancouver back in series 2, but the idea is it's just like a bulky steel type that can be pretty disruptive and be fairly difficult to knock out. But for the most part, it's very clear that this like whole fire, water, grass core is still really solid, and you don't necessarily need like Arcanine and Palafin, right? We have teams with like Gyarados and Chi-Yu, for example, instead, but it's just defensively so solid.
Yeah, just great type synergy in general. A very nice VGC classic. There really isn't too much to say. day, it's just like a lot of coverage. Like even if we scroll down to the top 128 teams, like there is a lot of what we expect, and then there's like a lot of surprises as well. But it's really hard to, I think, with such a big tournament. Of course, this was again the biggest international that we've had in VGC. When you have these kind of tournaments, there are so many outliers. For instance, Paul Chua, we talked about this before. He faced a lot of Palafin balanced teams. I think he faced like 6 or 7 in day 1. If you compare it to someone like my run, for instance, I did not face a single Palafin balanced team. I faced 1 Arcanine. So these runs can vary, and I think it really showcases like how important like being able to like beat all kinds of teams, as well as matchups wise, like having solid matchups throughout the board. I think it's just really important for being able to do well in these sorts of tournaments.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you know, I got rolled by like special or mixed Dondozo plus Dreadnought in the last round. That's not something I'm ever going to prepare for going into a tournament, and that's one of the strengths of using a team like that, right? My opponent executed it really well, and at the end of the day, I don't really feel that bad about it. It's like, yeah, unfortunately, I drew like the only player using that combination, and honestly, the team I was using was very Dreadnought weak. He had max speed Dondozo. It was either, you know, timid or hasty or jolly or whatever, and like I had prepared specifically for like admint max speed, which generally was the case, but this one opponent just had this like really crazy set, right? So like that's how Pokemon works sometimes. Sometimes you do just run into those crazy matchups that do like counter your team really well, and you're never going to have a perfect matchup against everything. For example, when Sejong Park won Worlds in 2014, his team was actually really weak to Gothitelle plus Mawile, which was one of the up-and-coming compositions going into that tournament, and Sejong ended up only, I think, playing 1 person with Goth Mawile, and that was actually his 1 loss in the Swiss round. So you can't possibly bring a team that has a good matchup against everything. You just have to bring something that you think does well into the majority of the field, hope that you don't run into too many bad matchups, and of course hope that you execute your good matchups well. That's just how the game goes sometimes, right? So it's like I finished 6-3, but in the end I felt like I won all the matchups I was expecting to. The Dondozo matchup in particular, like that Dondozo team in the top 4, I would expect to see certainly more in Regulation C, because having fought against it, it's just so flexible, especially when you're a really good player as well, because of all the different modes. Kind of my takeaway from seeing that team succeed is, okay, Dondozo is still really good. People are now using the Oblivious set that you were talking about. People are now moving away from Substitute. It's a little bit more offensive. Honestly, one of my big takeaways from this tournament is that like Bundle is still a lot better than I think people gave it credit for. Even for me, I used Bundle, but part of the reason I used it was because I was like, oh, like I don't think that many people are gonna bring it to this tournament. And then there's 4 in the top 8, which is like there was more Bundle than Fluttermane, which is not something I would have ever put a bet on, right? And so Booster Bundle still really good, still really valuable for speed control. And for Chi Yu, I think we've seen new adaptations where people are using like Focus Sash and Bulky Nasty Plot in particular. So those are 2 sets that I would have on your radar as this format progresses as well.
Yeah, I think usage stats wise, the fact there are 4 Palafins, 4 bundles, and 4 Amoonguses definitely tells you that kind of story of like usage stats. Player wise, we talked about this in our preview. Our hot takes, unfortunately, did not exactly advance to the day 2. We had, you know, of course, this was a stacked tournament. There was a lot of things to consider. There is a lot of variance in Pokemon, and going 2-3 was not something I was expecting myself. There was Eduardo Cune who dropped that 1-3, which is absolutely insane. Of course, the current world champion. Eric Rios was eliminated before the final round. Zachary Thornburg was also eliminated before the final round, finished 6-3 though. There were just a lot of solid players who did fail to make the day 2. Luca Paz, Gavin Michaels, all these players having very high success throughout the season, just not being able to advance to day 2. It is a very brutal tournament, but that is just the way of Pokemon sometimes.
Totally, yeah. Like I'm actually looking through like the, you know, top 128, like 64 to 120. I'm just looking at the number of like international champions we have here. Jeremy Rodriguez, who won NAIC. We had Gavin Michaels, who won OCIC. Yuri, who won, I think it was OCIC a few years ago. We had Marco Fierro, who also won OCIC a few years ago, right? So it's like multiple like world caliber, like contending players and championship level players that just fell short. A 6-3 today versus a 6-3 years ago feels really different. And I think 5 of my 9 opponents made day 2. And even just from round 1, I was like, man, like these players are so good now. Like my round 1 was super close. It was someone who had just started this season, and he literally got top 8 at his very first regionals in Europe. And I was like, back in the day, like your round 1s would be like players who didn't even have like fully EV'd Pokemon, and now I'm like literally sweating all the way until the end for my first round, which is, it's cool. It's a testament to how much the game has grown and how much the player base has improved. And so in the end, the finals honestly did not disappoint. Like Paul and Agati are really just 2 of the most consistent players throughout the last few years, 2 of the best. Paul's been playing literally for over a decade. Him and I competed against each other in seniors like back in 2012. It's his first IC victory, which seems kind of kind of crazy given how good at the game he's been for so long.
Yeah, especially since his first IC finals was actually back all the way in 2017, where he got second place to, I believe it was Chris Cotton in the NAIC finals. Overall, this was still a very solid tournament. There were a lot of strong players, of course, making day 2. The top 8 is, of course, very solid. Our hot takes, I think we covered a lot of it, and it was surprising. I think we got a lot right. There was a lot of weather, which even you brought weather. I called Latam doing really well, and like I knew Agati was super hungry after OCIC. He ended up making second. Paul Ray's making that top 8, and also Wanfi, I made day 2. But overall, very solid performances from Latam, I think, throughout this tournament, almost claiming their first IC win. Just fell a little bit short, but
I was personally curious about like how many of the top teams would have Ruin Mons. I think it was just Paul that didn't have a Ruin Mon, so I would have bet on at least like I think like 2 thinking about it. But in the end, I don't think teams necessarily need Ruin Mons, but they do just enable so much strength, and obviously the Ruin Mons are still just really powerful. I'm curious if Wo Chien maybe like sees a little bit more success after the beginning, because yeah, it's just like you mentioned, I think the best one was Megan, and she would finish 60th place with it. The main question is, where does the metagame go from here, right? It's clear that right now there's a couple of prevailing archetypes. You have your Palafin balance with, you know, like a strong dragon type, for example. You have your Dondozo, like this new Dondozo team that's popped up. Tailwind plus like offense is still around, although like James was like the best piloter of it here in the top 8. You have your kind of like bulky setup plus like redirection, whether it be Nasty Plot, Golden Go, Dragon Dance, Dragonite, you know, the Annihilate, for example. Trick Room actually way less common than I would have thought, and you called that out earlier, James, and so I'm wondering if there's like potential for hard Trick Room oriented teams to succeed going on later in the format. I'm also curious if any of the teams like move the needle in terms of the metagame. Like I think David Kotesh's Orthworm team is really fun, but it's like, is that something that actually picks up in usage? Because it's really difficult, I think, for an average player to just pick it up and understand how to pilot it. So it's like some of the crazier teams, really fun, really cool, but right now the metagame, I was gonna say it feels centralized, but there's like 5 or 6 different very viable compositions, and they all feel really powerful.
I don't think anything's off the books, and really I think this is just going to complicate more as we progress, because right now we have Dondozo that's still doing well, we have Palafin Balance that's still doing well. Will they still be able to keep the thrones and be consistent throughout? Probably, I would say so. For the rest of the teams, I think we could still see them evolve. James Evans actually told me that he only brought Xian Pao to like 1 match out of his entire run, which I'm super shocked if that's actually true, but he said like he would have preferred like almost anything over Xian Pao. So I definitely think we could still see teams without Ruined Pokemon doing well in this format, and I think that could pick up. Overall, right now, it seems like the Ruins are here to stay, and they are definitely impacting this format right now heavily.
Yeah, I think the last thing I want to comment on is like Ting Lu like ended up, you know, finishing first and second, but we had, you know, 3 Ting Lus in top 8, 2 Chiyus, 2 Qian Paos, and so like those 3 all feel really viable, quite frankly. And even within Ting Lu, we've seen like Assault Vest, we've seen Lumberry, for example, we've seen Choice Band. For Chiyu, we've seen Focus Sash, we've seen Life Orb, Choice Specs, Leftovers, Safety Goggles. Qian Pao is the one that feels a little bit more one-dimensional, where it's either often Focus Sash or Life Orb right now. Some of the Life Orb sets are interesting just because like you kind of mess up people's damage calcs, and people like Eevee, like Fluttermane to survive non-Life Orb, you know, Ice Spinner, but then when you add Life Orb to it, it just like ends up picking up the knockout. Point is, it's like all of those Pokemon have multiple viable sets. Ting Lu maybe having the most success at this tournament just because it feels a little bit more consistent. It feels really easy to bring into most matchups, and it's interesting, like kind of moving away from Fisher, as you mentioned, where neither of the top 2 players using Ting Lu had it, and they opted for just another move that was a little bit more consistent, which I think makes a ton of sense. You know, I look at Fluttermane and it's like, yeah, the usage is really high, but you definitely don't need it to succeed. And even if you have it on your team, I actually think Flutter is one of the more difficult Pokemon to use, because it's like, it is still Furrow at the end of the day, and it's weak to itself, and you're going to go up against opposing Fluttermanes a lot. And even though its usage is so high, I actually think it still feels fairly healthy to me. But those are my final thoughts.
I think I would say if I am right on predictions, the next time we're doing an NIC prediction, I think I have to put myself winning at this point, because maybe I'll be right that time. But all right, I think that's gonna be everything here at Beastcoast Pokemon. Thank you all for joining us to go over the European International Championship for 2023. Absolutely insane. We're gonna be continuing to use this format throughout the season leading up to the World Championship. NIC will actually be the final Series 3 event. We have multiple regional championships going on. Yeah, should be exciting to see how this evolves, because right now still looks like a lot of chaos right now, but at least we have, I think, more of a grasp of like what's actually being used in this format and what could be explored more.
The next 2 months will be really exciting to follow as we kind of conclude the pre-Worlds segment of the season and obviously build up hype for Worlds. But thanks as always for joining James and I here at Beastcoast Pokemon. Don't forget to leave a like or subscribe, give us any feedback on what you'd like to see us do in the future. And yeah, we're really excited to keep building this channel out with all of you. So thanks for joining.